Imagine an empire stretching across 11 time zones, commanding millions of soldiers, possessing some of the richest natural resources on Earth, and yet being slowly hollowed out from the inside by a problem so ordinary, so mundane, that its very name in Russian, Zhyatoknechestvo, sounds almost too bureaucratic to carry the weight of centuries. In 1762, Catherine the Great ascended the Russian throne and almost immediately received a report from her newly appointed provincial governors describing a state apparatus so thoroughly saturated with bribery that collecting taxes, administering justice, and conscripting soldiers had become exercises in negotiation rather than governance. The question that haunted Catherine, and that has haunted every Russian ruler before and after her, is this: why does a state powerful enough to defeat Napoleon, survive 2 world wars, and launch the first human being into space remain fundamentally incapable of defeating the corruption embedded in its own bones? To understand that, you have to go back much further than Catherine. You have to go back to the mud. Russia in the medieval period was not a compact, easily administered kingdom. It was a vast, sparsely populated territory of forests, rivers, and steppes, where communication between settlements could take weeks and where the central authority of any prince or czar was, in practical terms, extremely limited. The Muscovite state that emerged in the 15th century under Ivan III inherited a tradition of governance that historians sometimes call the feeding system, or kormlenie in Russian. Under this arrangement, officials sent from Moscow to administer distant territories were not paid a salary in the modern sense. Instead, they were quite literally expected to feed themselves from the population they governed. They collected fees for every service, every document stamped, every dispute adjudicated. The line between a legitimate fee and a bribe was not merely blurry, it was essentially non-existent. The system was the bribe, and this is the first crucial thing to understand: Russian corruption was not a deviation from the system. For centuries, it was the system. This matters enormously because it means that when later reformers tried to stamp out bribery, they were not fighting a disease that had infected a healthy body. They were trying to replace the circulatory system itself while the patient remained standing, and the patient more often than not resisted. Ivan the Terrible understood the problem, or at least understood that kormlenie was becoming politically unmanageable as his ambitions for a centralized state grew. In the 1550s, as part of a broader set of reforms, he formally abolished the feeding system and introduced a salary-based administrative structure in many regions. This sounds like progress, and in some ways it was. But here is the twist that Russian history keeps delivering. Ivan's new salaried officials were paid so little, so irregularly, and so unreliably that informal payments remained not just tempting, but existentially necessary. The reform abolished the legal framework for corruption. Without removing the economic conditions that made corruption rational, officials who did not supplement their income through informal means simply could not survive. The structural trap was set, and it would not be sprung for another 400 years if it has been sprung at all. By the time of the 17th century, the problem had become so embedded in Russian administrative culture that it generated its own vocabulary, its own etiquette, and its own moral philosophy. There were words for different kinds of payments. A pominka was a gift given in advance of a service, a pominki was given afterward, and zide was a payment for a specific favor. Russian Orthodox priests preached against bribery from their pulpits, citing biblical injunctions, and yet the same church was deeply embedded in a gift economy of its own, where donations secured prayers, positions, and ecclesiastical favors. Even the church, the moral authority that might have provided a counterweight, was structurally compromised. This is not a small detail. It means that the two institutions that might have checked each other, the state and the church, were both internally organized around informal payments. The reformer who wanted to clean up Russian governance had no clean institution to use as a laver. Then came Peter the Great, and the story gets darker and stranger simultaneously. Peter I, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, and who transformed Russia with a ferocity that left the country simultaneously modernized and traumatized, hated corruption with what contemporaries described as a visceral personal fury. He understood, having traveled to Western Europe and observed Dutch and English administrative systems, that efficient governance required honest officials. He created new institutions: the Senate in 1711, the colleges in 1718, and most importantly, the Office of the Fiscal, a network of secret informants tasked with rooting out corruption and reporting directly to the Tsar. He introduced the table of ranks in 1722, creating a merit-based hierarchy of state service. He executed corrupt officials publicly. He flogged them. He displayed their bodies as warnings. And yet Peter's own closest associates were among the most spectacularly corrupt figures in Russian history. Prince Alexander Menshikov, Peter's childhood friend and most trusted general, was caught embezzling state funds on a scale that would be impressive even by modern standards. Historians estimate that Menshikov diverted millions of rubles, the equivalent of a significant fraction of the state's annual revenue, into his own accounts and properties. Peter knew. Peter punished him repeatedly, fined him, threatened him, and then, because Menshikov was genuinely indispensable as a military and administrative talent, forgave him and promoted him again. The message this sent to the entire Russian bureaucracy was unmistakable. The rules applied to those without connections. Those with connections operated in a different moral universe. Peter had created, perhaps without fully intending to, a dual system that would define Russian governance for centuries. Formal rules that applied in principle, and informal networks that determined what actually happened. This duality is not incidental, it is the engine of the problem. When Catherine the Great came to power in 1762, she was fully aware of this inheritance. She was also, unlike many of her predecessors, a genuinely sophisticated intellectual who had read Montesquieu and corresponded with Voltaire. She understood that corruption was not simply a matter of individual moral failure, but a systemic problem rooted in institutional design. Her nakaz, the great instruction she issued in 1767 as a guide for a legislative commission, contains remarkably clear-eyed passages about the relationship between poverty, arbitrary power, and corruption. She knew that underpaid officials in a system without reliable rule of law would inevitably resort to informal payments. She knew that the absence of an independent judiciary meant that justice was always, at some level, for sale. But Catherine also needed the nobility. She needed the provincial gentry who ran the countryside. She needed the military officers who commanded her armies. And these men were not going to accept genuine reform that threatened their income streams, their local power, or their ability to extract value from the peasants and merchants beneath them. Catherine's famous provincial reform of 1775 reorganized Russia's administrative structure in ways that were genuinely innovative, but it simultaneously handed enormous local power to the nobility, whose corruption she was theoretically trying to combat. She understood the contradiction. Her private correspondence shows that she was not naive about it, but the political calculus of autocracy, the need to maintain elite support in a system without constitutional checks, made genuine reform structurally impossible. Every Tsar who followed her would face the same wall. Paul, I tried to crack down. Alexander, I created the Ministry of Internal Affairs in 1802 and launched multiple anti-corruption campaigns. Nicholas I, who ruled from 1825 to 1855 and who was arguably the most obsessive administrator in Russian imperial history, was so alarmed by the reports of corruption reaching his desk that he reportedly said there were only two honest men in Russia, himself and his heir, and he was not entirely sure about the heir. Nicholas created special inspection committees, sent trusted officials on secret investigations, and prosecuted hundreds of cases. The famous playwright Nikolai Gogol, writing in the 1830s and 1840s, turned Russian bureaucratic corruption into literature of genius. His play, The Government Inspector, first performed in 1836, depicts a provincial town thrown into panic by the arrival of what officials believe is a secret inspector from St. Petersburg. Every official in the play is corrupt. Every one of them assumes the inspector is there to expose them. The comedy is devastating because the audience knows that the real inspector, whenever he eventually arrives, will find exactly what the fake one found. Nicholas I reportedly laughed at the play, then fell silent and said that everyone had gotten it, including himself. That moment of self-awareness from an autocrat who simultaneously refused to change the fundamental conditions producing the corruption is, in miniature, the entire history of the problem. What was actually happening in the Russian provinces during Nicholas's reign? The documentary record painstakingly assembled by historians like Richard Pipes, Orlando Figes, and more recently Yanni Kotsonis is remarkable for its consistency. A merchant in Nizhny Novgorod who wanted a trading license paid not just the official fee, but a series of informal payments to the clerk who processed the application, the official who signed it, and the supervisor who could delay it indefinitely. A peasant who wanted to register a land dispute in court paid at every stage of the process. A military conscript who wanted to be assigned to a garrison post rather than a combat unit paid the recruiting officer. A nobleman who wanted a favorable judgment in an inheritance case paid the judge. None of these payments were recorded. All of them were understood. The entire system functioned on the assumption that formal rules were the public face of governance, and informal payments were the actual mechanism. The two coexisted not in tension but in a kind of symbiosis. The formal rules actually increased the value of informal payments because they created more points at which an official could obstruct, delay, or deny, and therefore more points at which a payment could unlock progress. Now here is where the story takes a turn that most people do not expect. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861, one of the most consequential events in Russian history, actually made the corruption problem worse in the short term. This seems paradoxical. Surely freeing 40 million people from bondage would reduce the arbitrary power of officials and landlords. In some ways it did. But the emancipation also created an enormous new bureaucratic apparatus to manage the transition: redemption payments, land allotments, passports for newly mobile peasants, registration of new communes. Every one of these processes was administered by officials who were underpaid, overworked, and operating in a legal environment where informal payments remained the lubricant of the system. The newly freed peasants, who had previously dealt primarily with their landlords, now encountered the state bureaucracy directly for the first time, and what they found was a system that extracted money from them at every interaction. The liberation from serfdom was real. The liberation from arbitrary extraction was not. The late imperial period, from roughly 1880 to 1917, saw corruption intertwine with something even more dangerous: the intersection of bribery with political loyalty. In a system where the Tsar's favor determined careers and where political opposition was treated as treason, the corruption of officials became entangled with the question of who could be trusted. Officials who were corrupt but politically loyal were often protected. Officials who were honest but politically suspect were vulnerable. This created a perverse selection mechanism. The system tended to promote the corrupt and loyal over the honest and independent. By the time of Nicholas II, the last Tsar, the senior levels of the imperial bureaucracy were populated by men whose primary skill was navigating networks of patronage and informal obligation. The brilliant reformers, Sergei Witte, Pyotr Stolypin, were exceptional precisely because they were exceptions. And both of them in different ways were ultimately undermined by the system they were trying to reform. Stolypin's land reforms of 1906 to 1911 are particularly instructive. He understood that the commune system, which kept peasants tied to collective land arrangements, was economically inefficient and socially stagnant. He pushed through legislation that allowed peasants to consolidate individual holdings. The reforms were genuinely ambitious, but implementing them required a provincial bureaucracy that was honest, competent, and motivated by the public interest. What Stolypin had was a provincial bureaucracy that was underpaid, politically pressured, and deeply accustomed to extracting value from every administrative process. Land consolidation surveys were delayed unless payments were made. Titles were registered incorrectly. Local officials favored the wealthy peasants who could afford larger informal payments. Stolypin was assassinated in 1911, but his reforms were already being strangled not by political opposition alone, but by the administrative corruption that made implementation impossible on the ground. Then came 1917, and the Bolsheviks promised something extraordinary: a complete break with the past. They promised not just a new government, but a new human being, one purged of the bourgeois vices of greed and self-interest. Lenin was acutely aware of the corruption problem. His writings in the early Soviet period are full of furious denunciations of bureaucratic sabotage, bribery, and what he called the old habits of the Tsarist apparatus infecting the new Soviet state. He was not wrong about the infection. The early Soviet government inherited much of the old imperial bureaucracy because it had no alternative. The new communist cadres were too few and too inexperienced to run a modern state alone. The old clerks, the old administrators, the old police officials, many of them simply continued working under new masters, bringing their old habits with them. The red stamp replaced the imperial eagle, but the informal payment for the stamp often remained. The Soviet response to corruption was characteristically extreme and characteristically ineffective. There were purges, show trials, executions. The Soviet criminal code made bribery a capital offense in certain circumstances. The secret police, the Cheka, then the OGPU, then the NKVD, were given sweeping powers to investigate and punish corrupt officials, and yet by the 1930s, as Stalin's industrialization drive created enormous pressure to meet impossible production quotas, corruption had not been eliminated. It had evolved. Factory managers who could not meet their quotas falsified records. Officials who needed scarce materials obtained them through informal networks of mutual favor. The Blatt system, a word that roughly translates as the use of personal connections and informal exchange to obtain goods and services, became the connective tissue of Soviet economic life. It was not exactly bribery in the traditional sense. It was something more diffuse, more social, more deeply embedded in everyday survival. You did not necessarily pay cash. You exchanged favors, access, goods, services. The currency was connection rather than money, but the logic was identical. Formal channels did not work, so informal ones did. Stalin knew about Blatt. He knew about the falsification of production statistics. He knew that the command economy he had created generated systematic dishonesty because it made honesty economically irrational. A factory director who honestly reported that he had failed to meet his quota faced punishment. One who falsified his records and reported success faced promotion until the falsification was discovered, at which point he faced the gulag or worse. The system created a rational incentive to lie and to bribe those who might expose the lie. Stalin's response was terror, which suppressed some corruption through fear but also created new corruption because in a system of arbitrary terror, the ability to denounce someone became itself a form of power that could be bought and sold. The post-Stalin period, particularly the Brezhnev era from 1964 to 1982, is often described by historians as the golden age of Soviet corruption. This is not hyperbole. With the terror removed and the command economy calcified, the informal economy of Blatt, bribery, and mutual protection networks expanded to fill the space. Regional party bosses in places like Soviet Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Uzbekistan ran what were effectively personal fiefdoms, extracting tribute from the local economy and sending a portion upward to Moscow in exchange for political protection. The Uzbek cotton affair, which began to unravel in the early 1980s, revealed that party officials in Uzbekistan had been falsifying cotton production statistics for decades, collecting state payments for cotton that did not exist, and distributing the proceeds through a network of bribes that reached into the highest levels of the Moscow party apparatus. The scale was staggering. Estimates suggest that billions of rubles were involved over the course of the fraud. And the fraud had been sustained for so long, not because the auditors were incompetent, but because the auditors were paid to be incompetent. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, explicitly promising to clean up the Soviet system. His campaign against corruption was real, and his anti-alcohol campaign, launched in the same year, was partly motivated by the connection between alcohol distribution networks and organized bribery. But Gorbachev's reforms, like those of every reformer before him, ran into the same structural wall. The officials who were supposed to implement anti-corruption measures were the same officials who were corrupt. The party apparatus that was supposed to enforce accountability was the same apparatus that had protected corrupt regional bosses for decades. And when Gorbachev's glasnost policies began to allow open reporting on corruption, what Soviet citizens discovered was not reassuring. The revelations did not produce a reform consensus. They produced a collapse of legitimacy. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, and what followed was not a clean break. It was a catastrophic collision between the collapse of the old informal systems and the creation of new ones. The privatization of state assets in the 1990s, carried out at extraordinary speed under conditions of legal chaos, created opportunities for corruption on a scale that dwarfed anything in Soviet history. Officials who controlled the privatization process could direct assets to favored buyers. Bureaucrats who controlled licenses, permits, and registrations for new businesses could extract payments at every step. The new Russian state was simultaneously trying to build market institutions, democratic institutions, and rule of law institutions, while the people running those institutions were operating in an environment where informal payments remained the only reliable way to get anything done. The 1990s did not create Russian corruption, but they gave it a new vocabulary, new instruments, and new scale. Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000 partly on the promise of restoring order and fighting corruption. His early years did see some genuine prosecution of corrupt officials, particularly those whose corruption was politically inconvenient, but the fundamental structure remained unchanged. The state remained the primary source of economic value through licenses, contracts, regulatory approvals, natural resource access, and access to the state remained mediated by personal connections and informal payments. What changed was not the system, but the management of the system. corruption became more centralized, more hierarchical, more predictable in some ways. The arbitrary, small-scale bribery that had made everyday life miserable in the 1990s was reduced in some areas. But the grand corruption at the top, the diversion of state resources to politically connected elites, arguably increased. So why has Russia never been able to defeat bribery? The answer, when you trace it across these centuries, is not simple, and it is not reducible to any single cause. It is not simply a matter of culture, though culture matters. It is not simply a matter of geography, though the vastness of the territory and the difficulty of supervision across enormous distances have always made monitoring officials extraordinarily difficult. It is not simply a matter of poverty, though the chronic underpayment of officials has always made informal income economically rational. It is not simply a matter of autocracy, though the concentration of power without accountability has always created opportunities for extraction without consequence. The deeper answer is structural and self-reinforcing. Every attempt at reform has been implemented through the same apparatus that produces the problem. Every reformer. From Ivan the Terrible to Peter the Great to Catherine to Alexander II to Lenin to Gorbachev has faced the same paradox. The only tool available for fighting corruption is the state, and the state is the primary site of corruption. The reformer who wants honest officials must use dishonest officials to find and train honest ones. The leader who wants rule of law must use a system built on personal loyalty rather than legal principle to create legal institutions. The revolutionary who wants to build a new society must use the human beings shaped by the old one. There is also something else. Something that the sources hint at, but that is harder to quantify. In a society where the state has historically been experienced as predatory rather than protective, where the Tsar's officials took rather than gave, where Soviet planners demanded rather than provided, where the post-Soviet state extracted rather than enabled, the moral framework around corruption is different. When ordinary Russians paid bribes to navigate the Soviet system, they did not always experience this as moral failure. They experienced it as survival. The state was the enemy, or at least the obstacle, and finding ways around it was not corruption in the moral sense. It was ingenuity. It was solidarity. It was the Blatt system as a form of human warmth in a cold, bureaucratic world. This moral reframing, accumulated over centuries, means that the social stigma that might otherwise check corrupt behavior has been systematically eroded. Corruption is not just a rational choice in Russia's historical context. It is, for many people, a culturally legitimate one. The Russian Orthodox Church, which might have provided a sustained moral counterweight, was itself too deeply embedded in the structures of state power and too thoroughly compromised by its own internal economies of informal payment to serve as an independent check. The intelligentsia produced brilliant critics, Gogol, Saltykov-Shatrin, Chekhov, all of whom anatomized corruption with devastating precision. But literary criticism, however brilliant, does not change administrative incentive structures. The critics described the disease with extraordinary accuracy. They could not prescribe a cure that the patient was willing to take. What remains then is this: a state that has repeatedly demonstrated the capacity for extraordinary feats, military conquest, industrial transformation, scientific achievement, survival against seemingly impossible odds, but that has never managed to solve the problem that a provincial clerk in Novgorod in 1550 and a customs official in Vladivostok in 1990 would both recognize immediately. The bribe is not a symptom of Russian weakness. It is, in a profound and troubling sense, a symptom of Russian adaptation, the way that ordinary people and powerful officials alike have learned to function within a state that has never quite trusted its own citizens enough to pay them honestly, govern them transparently, or hold its own powerful people accountable to the same rules as everyone else. Every empire has its shadow economy. Russia's has simply lasted longer, run deeper, and proven more resistant to the light than almost any other in modern history. And understanding why that is true tells you something essential, not just about Russia, but about what happens to any state when the gap between formal rules and actual practice becomes wide enough and lasts long enough to feel like the natural order of things